Hey everyone, SweetJohnnyCage here. Wanted to spend some time talking about my thoughts on Final Fantasy 16. It is not common for me to review games, although I do know that I just did this with The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. It's not something I'm looking to make normal on this channel. It's just two games back to back had a bit of an impact on me, and I wanted to spend some time talking about them and getting my thoughts out there and seeing what everybody else thinks. Okay, so I'm going to start this discussion by bringing up the negatives of the game. There aren't many, but the ones that exist are important. And then after that, I'll talk about the positives. So, full disclosure, I recorded this an hour ago, and as I was editing it, I just didn't like the way it came out, so I'm redoing this. So if my enthusiasm seems like a little reduced, just know it's not because I'm less enthusiastic. It's just I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself here a little bit. So, in terms of the negatives, the number one thing that needs to be addressed, and this has been spoken about already, but I didn't feel right making a video praising Final Fantasy 16 without also highlighting some big negatives. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the complete dearth of black characters in this game. There is not a single one in the entire game. I spent, I think, 71 hours with this game, give or take like 2 or 3 hours with note-taking and just sort of like re-recording certain things for guides. There is not a single black character in this game. Not a one. And it's one thing for there not to be black characters like prevalent in the marketing. Like, I kind of wondered, are people like jumping the gun a little bit like prior to the release of the game because they just didn't know, but then reviews were coming out saying the same thing, and then having played the whole thing myself, there's not a single black person in this game, and it is remarkable. It is crazy to me that in the year 2023, we can have these incredible, cinematic, beautiful games and not have a single black person in them. Granted, there is not, as far as I can tell, like a single person of Asian descent or Pacific Island descent or really anything but Anglo-Saxon European and Middle East, if you want to go that far, but even that feels like a bit of a stretch. The lack of minority representation in this game is shameful. It's shameful. There's no way to sugarcoat that. And upon thinking about that topic, I started to go back in my brain encyclopedia of video games, specifically Final Fantasy games that I've played. I've played everything from 6 up until now, including 11 a little bit, and including a little bit of 14. I can think of 3 black characters in Final Fantasy, not including like random town NPCs that you talk to. I'm talking people who are actually important to the story. There's Barrett in 7. He famously is a caricature of a black person. Basically, Mr. T. He does get character development later on in the game, but for the vast majority of it, he's a bit of a caricature. It seems like in 7 Remake, they're doing a bit better by him, and hopefully that continues in Rebirth and eventually Part 3. In Final Fantasy VIII, there's Kyros, who is a bit of a minor character, but he does play an important part of the story, but he is part of the supporting cast. 9, as far as I know, does not have any that I can think of. A lot of people in that world are not necessarily human, but again, it doesn't really help. 12, I don't think there are any that I can think of. And who is the third one? In 13, there's Saz. Saz is part of the main cast. He does have a compelling story. However, he's not a great character, just overall. Like I don't know. The story of 13 really focuses on Lightning, Snow, and Vanille, and Fang, as well as Sarah. The other cast, Hope has a pretty good arc, but Saz doesn't. Like, his arc kind of ends in the beginning of the game once Dodge turns into a crystal, his son, so he doesn't really go anywhere, and kind of has some stereotypes about him, so he's just not a great character overall. And then we get to 15. None of the party members are of anything but white descent. And then, I don't even remember any NPCs that were black. And so this isn't like a problem unique to Final Fantasy 16. It's just so prevalent in this game because of the way the game works. It's very similar to 14 and even 7 Remake, where like You go up to a character, and then it's a single camera shot on that character. You talk to them, it goes back to Clive or whoever's talking in the party, and then it's just sort of like single shot camera work. So you're zoomed in on people all the time, and it's just obvious. There's not a single black person in this game, and it's shameful. Like I said, it hurts the game, and I have a coworker. We were discussing. This game always comes up, but like we were discussing Elden Ring. And she told me, like, oh, I don't really want to play that game because, like, the character creator really sucks and I can't, like, make somebody who looks like me. And, like, I never really thought of that. And I fully recognize I'm a white dude. Like, I am as pale as they come. I do not have the black experience. I don't have any sort of minority experience. Like, sure, Irish immigrants in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, were treated pretty shittily in New York. But, like, that pales in comparison to really anything any non-white person experiences in this country and around the world. And so I never really thought about that. Like, I don't spend any time in character creators, even really good ones like Demon's Souls. Like, I don't care. I just press start and go. Like, I don't care about character creators. But, like, a lot of people do. And a lot of people really care that they are represented in what they are playing or the media that they are consuming. And I think that's really important. And again, in 2023, like, we are 26 years removed from the first 3D Final Fantasy game in Final Fantasy VII, and we still can't do it. Like, we still can't get black people in these games or any sort of minorities in this game. Like, it's crazy. And there was a tweet, like, just before I made this video, of somebody asking, and I'm going to put the picture up, of somebody asking, like, who's the best Final Fantasy protagonist? And it lists every single one from 1 to 15, including 11 and 14. And they're all white. Every single one is white. And it's like 30 plus years of Final Fantasy. And this is what we got? Like, it's frustrating. It is really, really frustrating. And I think what adds so much fuel to the fire here is that the creators of the game were asked about this prior to release. And their reasoning was it's a traditional fantasy setting, and so we wanted to keep with those traditions. But it's not like black people didn't exist in the Middle Ages when a lot of fantasy settings are set. You know, like, there was slavery, which this game, that's basically the story of this game, is, like, liberating yourself from bondage and, like, one subset of the human race being treated worse than the other and being enslaved. And, like, I get it, like, maybe this is where, like, I try to come up with some reasoning for it, where, like, maybe they just didn't want to touch on something so sensitive, but, like, in a game that outright has slavery, like, I maybe can get, like, not wanting to have black characters in those roles, maybe, but it would at least be honest, right? Like, it would at least be an honest representation of that experience. But you could, it's their world that they created. They could do anything they want, and they chose not to have any black characters, really any minority characters. The people of the desert of Dhalmekia, I think, are definitely supposed to be Middle Eastern. Like, they're darker skinned, and, like, you know, this is more religious than race, but, like, they wear turbans. The setting is very Middle Eastern, but archetypal Middle Eastern, but, like, even then, it just feels like they are the same character models, just made tan. Like, they don't feel real. And so it's a mark against the game. And I wanted to just say that right away. So in the same vein, there's another topic around representation that I wanted to talk about. And, like, obviously this is like a spoiler-heavy review, but there's a character, a main character in the story that is gay, or at the very least bisexual. And this is made obvious. It's Prince Dion, who is the crown prince of the kingdom of Sambrek, later the Crystalline Dominion. He is the dominant of Bahamut. And there is a scene, a third of the way through the game, where he shares a kiss with his, like, right-hand man in the military, Terrence. And it is established in the lore of the game. Like, you can read the lore of the game throughout the game, which is a really cool thing. But you can read it. And it says, like, it doesn't even say that they are a couple or boyfriends or anything. It classifies them as lovers. And to me, that feels, one, really antiquated, and two, kind of weird, because the moment that they share together is so heartfelt, and they do share a kiss, although the camera zooms way out and it's a little fuzzy. But they do share a tender, genuine moment, but then it's kind of never addressed again. It's not really made part of Dion or Terrence's characters, except in one scene very late in the game where Dion tells Terrence, like, hey, take this money, go find this girl in this village. She nursed me back to health. I want her to be taken care of. I'm marching on to my next mission that I may not come back from. Like, this is my final duty that I'm, like, charging you with. Please go execute it. And then, like, Terrence is very upset. It's a very strained, pained moment. But, like, that's it. Like, there's no kiss goodbye. There's no hug. There's no nothing. It's just, go do this thing. I'm the prince. I know this hurts, but you've got to go. That's it. And then, like, even at the end, like, the last thing Dion says in the game is, like, about his father. And, like, he's basically plummeting to his presumed death after a battle. And he says, like, Father, we've done it, or something. There's no mention of Terrence. There's no nothing. And, like, throughout the game, you are bringing people into the hideaway, or, like, your hub. And, like, these people are often the curse bearers, or the crystal, the bearers that you are freeing from slavery and bringing to this hideaway and giving them a choice, freedom of their lives. And, like, you recruit allies and they show up as well. And it's like, if I had a boyfriend or a husband or something, and, like, I was then welcomed into this hideaway and, like, given a better choice at life, why wouldn't I go bring him with me? Like, there's nothing in the world of Alethea of 16 that is saying that you can't be gay. Like, again, it's a fantasy setting. The creators could have done what they wanted, and they chose to allow this character to have a tender moment. They chose to create this tender moment for this character, establish that he's gay, but then just do nothing with it and, like, treat it almost as, like, a tertiary, fourth-rate, fifth-rate kind of attribute or part of his character, even though it's, like, a big thing. You know, like, there's only 2 kisses in the entire game. One is between, or 3 maybe. One is between Clive and Jill, who don't get together until pretty late in the game, which I actually liked. I liked that it wasn't an instantaneous thing. And Dion and Terrence. And it just feels like a half measure. And as somebody who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, like, it upset me. Like, it bummed me out that, like, you have this moment that is very important where they share this heartfelt moment. They're established as a couple, but the game then kind of does everything to kind of just not acknowledge it ever and not make it important. And that I found frustrating. I don't like half measures in storytelling. Either do it or don't. And, like, I find that oftentimes people who are writing games don't know how to write gay characters or, you know, anything other than straight characters. And the reality is you just write them like normal characters because they are normal people. There's no, you know, it's a normal thing. Just write them as a good character. And for all intents and purposes, Dion is a good character. Terrence is definitely a minor character and just, you know, only appears a couple times. But, like, they make this an important part of Dion's character and then just ignore it. And they have so many opportunities where it can be, like, if it was a straight character, it would have, I can almost guarantee it would have played out differently. But because he's gay, or at the very least bisexual, like, they choose to play it a different way and just kind of, like, shun it or, like, just put it in the closet. And, like, I didn't like that at all. I found it frustrating. I wish it were different. I am glad that Final Fantasy, at least as far as I'm aware, has its first, like, major player that's gay, or at the very least bisexual, like, that person is there, and that, like, they were given that moment, but it feels wrong to then, like, take that moment away or just keep ignoring it and, like, play into the trope of we shouldn't be together. And it's like, but why? Like, why though? You know, like, it's the world of Alethea. It's not Florida. You know, like, no one gives a shit. You don't have to care. Treat them like normal characters, and it's just so much easier. So I found that frustrating. I do want to acknowledge, though, that I know that around the world, not that America is this shining beacon of rainbow coalition rights or anything, or the treatment of people in that community. I know that in Japan, and especially in a lot of Asian countries, it's either illegal or it's decriminalized, but like there's no marriage equality, there's no nothing, often very stigmatized nationwide. And so, like, I understand that coming from a Japanese company, it may be difficult. It may put them in a difficult position to produce a game that has something like that in prominence or in a prominent place. I do get that. But, like, you've already ripped the Band-Aid off by showing them Kiss. Just get it over with. Like, you're already there. You already got the hard part done. Just, what's the problem? You know, you already ripped the Band-Aid off. Just keep going. Like, you don't have to show them having sex on screen. Like, you never need to show that with anybody, straight or otherwise. But just make Terrence part of Dion's life. Like, you already did, but now you're not. It was very frustrating. Okay, so those are the two big social kind of issues that I have with the game. The rest is all gameplay related or game design related. So, there is a lack of like color in this world, and what I mean by that is this sort of is like a multi-pronged problem, and it's a typical medieval setting, and so you have a lot of wood, you have a lot of brick, you have a lot of open fields, which is fine. It's cool. And I love that this game has towns and villages and NPCs that you can talk to, even if it's just flavor text. The side quests are really good. The world feels alive, and which is a huge accomplishment coming from 15. But everything is small scale because you can't explore any of the cities. And the cities is usually really in the world where you find like the most vibrancy. Like it's the loudest, it's the brightest, it's the biggest, especially in games. And unfortunately, 16, you cannot explore a single city. You go through them on missions. Usually it's in the process of being destroyed or obliterated by something, so everything's in ruins, and it's gray, and it's dark, and it's smoky, and it's on fire. So like the color palette doesn't really get to be explored. And so it feels kind of drab most of the time. And, you know, you go to the cities, but like I said, you're on missions. And so it kind of sucks that you can't explore a city as a player. Like you can't walk through a city. And I get it. Video games are very difficult to make, and the more dense the detail, the harder it is to create just in general. And so it becomes very expensive, extremely time consuming. I get that you can't have a fully one-to-one Manhattan or Tokyo, like you just can't do it. I get it. But at least let me roam the streets for a little while. Like, even if it's just 2 blocks, like, give me that. It was frustrating. But again, story-wise, I get it. Like, every time you reach a city, it's getting destroyed, or your job is to destroy it. So I get it. But again, like, there's a cutscene in which, like, Sid and Clive and Jill and Torgal are, like, they sort of, like, holed up in a brothel, like, waiting to infiltrate the city to, like, go on their mission. And, like, they sort of overlook the streets. And it's like, ooh, let me go there. But the game just doesn't let you. So kind of frustrating. Also with the color is I have been, hopefully, through editing, putting in gameplay clips throughout this review. And at this point, what I'm going to show you is that throughout the story, or as the story plays out, you kind of get into what I like to call the world of ruin. And that's a term from Final Fantasy VI, where something happens and then the world kind of goes to shit. I like this. Now it's sort of a trope at this point, but like I like this trope. I think it's really cool. I like seeing a world get destroyed and then things change. You have to save it. The people like go nuts or they get killed, and there's a lot of death and destruction. I think it's a cool thing to do. And a lot of RPGs have this. And I'm cool with it in 16. But the problem is that when it happens, it's not just that like the world starts to like go bad, but the sky changes. And normally this is fine. I think this is a cool thing. However, the problem is the implementation. And what I mean by that is that the sky turns purple. And nothing against the color purple or the movie, But this gets very annoying when you are, one, exploring the world, but it's especially frustrating when you are speaking with NPCs in sort of that zoomed in, like, single shot dialogue. And this is especially prevalent in the desert and canyon regions of the game, where the sun is still so bright. It's like the same brightness setting as it was prior to the purple clouds. But now, because everything's purple, it's very hard on the eyes, because when the clouds part or are moving in the skybox, it's getting very bright and then very dark. And this is fine under natural lighting circumstances where you have the brightness of the sun and then the shadow of a cloud. The colors don't change that much. It's just a little bit darker. But now that everything's purple, it is very tough on the eyes. And again, it gets very frustrating because now things seem very, like, unnatural. And I get it. It's the world of ruin. The villain of the game has changed the skies and started the destruction of the world. I get it. But you can serve the story without, like, destroying the beauty of the game. And I think that just having this purple filter over everything really destroys the beauty of this game. And I get it. Like, it's the world of ruin. It's the apocalypse. It shouldn't look pretty. I get it. But it's frustrating, especially when going back and reviewing the footage that I'm editing. I noticed this before, is like the first half of the game, everything looked beautiful and bright and great. And then everything after that is purple. And it's like, I just wish it wasn't purple. It could be a variety of colors. Just do something different. But this purple hue over everything gets frustrating. And especially, it's especially frustrating because you have these lush green fields that you explore, or these vast open deserts, and they are still the same graphical fidelity and the graphical quality, which is amazing in this game. But now everything's purple and the lighting doesn't play well with it. So I just wish it was implemented differently. I think it's implemented very well in the continent of Ash, which is the second continent that you go to about 3/4 of the way through the game. There is no sunshine on this continent, but it still has that gray/purple hue, and it looks fine. It plays very nicely there. It seems like that continent was designed with that part of the story in mind, whereas Storm, the original continent, the first one that you're on, for the majority of the game, kind of wasn't. And so I just wish they moved the event of the sky turning for when you go to Ash. I feel like it would have served the same, like, impetus of the story, but you just wouldn't have spent so much time on Storm going through it with this purple sky. It also makes it feel like the end of the world is taking forever, whereas, like, in reality, it's not. Like, it's only a few days. Whereas, like, because of the amount of time that you spend, especially if you're doing all the side quests and everything and all the hunts, it just feels like it takes forever, and you're constantly being exposed to this purple, weird lighting. So I wish that was different. So a couple more things. The variety in this game when it comes to enemies is lacking. And I get it. Like I said before, like, games they take a long time to make, which equates to a lot of money. And 3D games especially with combat this fast and frenetic, and creating, animating, rigging, and all of that for enemies, for anybody, or anything in a game, takes a very long time, and it's a painstaking process. It has been since the advent of video games. It's gotten better, but as graphics get better, the work gets harder. Like, that's why games take so long these days. So it does get a little frustrating, though, because you end up fighting the same kinds of enemies. They're just different colors or have different effects on them. And it's one thing for an enemy to be a different color to represent a different element, but now it's just the typical, okay, this thing started normal human looking, then it got red, then it got blue, now it's really hard. Like, it's the same enemy type, it's just a different color, different effect, and this goes on for the entire game. I'd say there's probably maybe 15 different enemy types in the game, 20 being generous, and especially coming from the older Final Fantasies, from the Pixel era up until the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, like, the enemy variety felt vast, whereas now it feels very small. But again, I get it. It was just kind of disappointing, especially around the hunts, or the hunt board. There is not a single unique enemy that you go and kill. every single one of them is a reskin of either like a sub boss or a boss, or even like an enemy that's just a bit bigger and maybe has a couple new abilities. Like, there is no unique model of enemy that you are fighting on any hunts. And if you're doing the hunts as they become available, you then will fight that enemy again as a huge boss. Granted, as a story boss, they tend to have crazier abilities, which is really cool. But it just kind of like makes the variety like really small, and like the well kind of runs dry pretty quick, and that sucks. It doesn't feel great. The other thing around variety is weapon variety, and what I mean by this is weapon design variety. So the game, or the combat of the game, is very, very much centered around your icon abilities, your magic. These are flashy as hell. They are really cool. There's a total of 7 different icons that you get the powers of, ranging from Phoenix to Odin. It runs the full gamut. Possible DLC with Leviathan if like some tidbits in the story are hints at anything, and possibly something that you can kind of see in the world. Maybe Leviathan is DLC, but the icon abilities are awesome. The regular combat weapons are lacking, and this wouldn't be a problem if there wasn't a focus on it. And what I mean by that is you can acquire weapons in 3 different ways. I think there's 2, maybe 3 that you get out of treasure chests, just scattered throughout the world. You can buy them from vendors, or you can craft weapons with the blacksmith. The crafted weapons with the blacksmith are always better. Always, always better. I think there's only 1 sword in the game that you get out of a treasure chest. As you are going through Sanbreque in the mines, that sword is better than what you can have up to that point in the game, so you will use that sword. Everything else is worse. So, like, crafting is always the way to go. And because there's this focus on crafting, and because there's a storyline, a pretty deep storyline to do with the blacksmith that keeps progressing as the game goes on, you keep unlocking new parts of that story, it's disappointing that all the weapons kind of look the same. And again, like, it's tough to do things in video games, like as far as creation. Like, they are really challenging to make. It is astounding that as many games get released, because for one game that gets released, I guarantee you 10 are just canceled or just never really get off the ground. They are really difficult to make. And so I get it. I get that this is time and money, but when you take a look at another Final Fantasy, say even 7 Remake, the weapon or the sword variety just for Cloud, there's only like 7 or 8, I think, swords in that game that Cloud can use, but all of them look pretty unique. They're all kind of different, and they're cool looking. Like, they're just cool looking swords, man. And they all have the same general shape. They're a sword, but you have the rune blade that's very thin and narrow. You have, of course, the Buster Sword that's really wide. Then you have the final one that he gets that sort of curves at the end and has like a lot of materia slots in it and just looks cool. Every single sword in 15 kind of looks the same, with very little exception. Maybe 2 or 3 of them don't. And there is a huge quest line that then ends in you being able to craft the ultimate weapon of the game, which is the Gotodamarung. I'm saying this not having played New Game Plus or Final Fantasy difficulty, so I don't know if there's new weapons in there. But the Gotodamarung basically looks like the first sword that you have with Clive. Like, it just doesn't look that different. And for the effort that you have to go through to create that, through collecting materials from the hunts and side quests, it's just disappointing that like all the swords kind of look the same. And yeah, I just wish that was different. So I really wish there was more attention paid to the creativity behind the weapons, because you only control one character, and so you're always looking at him and you're always looking at his sword. And even though it has 375, 425 attack power, it doesn't really look any different, and it's not doing anything different. Just wish that was different. Okay, so that's the negative half of this video. Now I want to get into the positives. The first thing that I will say, take a quick drink. The first thing I will say is that this is a full game. There are no loose ends in this game. There is like a hint that Leviathan is lost or missing or something like that, but it's not like Final Fantasy 15 where somebody says, I'm going to go look for Leviathan, I'll see you in 10 hours, and then suddenly shows up again and has Leviathan. It's not like that. It's just there's a hint that maybe Leviathan could be explored as an icon or as part of the story. Maybe. It is a complete game. And coming from Final Fantasy 15, I am so happy about that. I have played every Final Fantasy from 6 until now. I've finished 6 earlier this year or last year. I finished 13 last year. And these were games, I bought 13 on release, didn't really like it. 7 was my first RPG, so it was my first Final Fantasy. I guess aside from Super Mario RPG. But 6, I had started and stopped in various forms. Never owned it on SNES, but I played it on emulators. I played it on PSP. I had it on the SNES Classic. Like, I tried it so many times. Finally finished it. And so I've played them all. And I have never been more like disappointed in a game than I was in 15. And I was so worried that 16 was going to have the same issues, because it really felt like at the time Square had kind of lost their way with this series. I don't think they were in I know that they were in financial trouble with 14, and then 14 had this crazy rebirth with A Realm Reborn and is now the most successful MMO ever. And there are so many great elements of 14 in 16. That was very obvious from like scene 1 of this game, or combat 1 of this game. But I was very worried that because 15 was released incomplete, had a famously bad development cycle, lots of crunch, lots of direction changes. The world of that game is completely empty. It's just like famously incomplete, and the characters leave at random times and then come back, and then they sold that as DLC for $10 a pop, and then they decided to make a DLC about the final boss and like explore his story, even though that really should have been explored in the base game. Like, I was so worried about 16. Happy to report it's a full game. Start to finish, it's all here, and then some. And then we have some hints as to what could be explored in the future, but Leviathan missing is like a throwaway line. It appears twice in a 70-hour game. Don't worry about it. If it doesn't happen, it didn't need to happen, but that could be the DLC, but it is a complete game. There's no loose ends in the story. Everything ties together nicely. There is a lot of exposition towards the end. However, it is not nearly as bad as some RPGs are. The exposition at the end does not introduce new concepts. It does not introduce new threads of the story that are then left unresolved. It's just expounding upon what we already know and painting the full picture, like sort of like zooming out the forest from the trees and saying, hey, here's what's really been going on. I've been trying to control this. I've been trying to control that. I've been trying to control you. Let's fight. Like, it's just sort of how it goes. It's super, super good. The overall story is about choice and free will, and again, liberation from slavery. And I think that's a really good story. It's not necessarily a new story. It's been told plenty of times, even in Final Fantasy, 13 being the most recent. 15 didn't really have much to do about fate, I don't think. I don't really remember the story of that game. 13 was very prominent with fate and the Lassie and Fal'Cie, and like people being controlled by gods and having to fulfill their purpose, and they turn into a crystal and like kind of die. 16 is not anywhere near as convoluted as 13. It's a fairly straightforward story, but it does go in interesting directions, and it does explore interesting concepts. All of the characters, and I mean all the characters of this game, get a full arc, including some of the minor side quest characters. Clive, most notably, he's a prince. In the prologue of the game, his younger brother dies. He isn't able to save him. His father dies. He feels like a complete failure, and he's basically sold into slavery to be an assassin for the rival army. And then comes across Jill, his like adoptive sister, sort of, and comes across her like 10 years later. And then like they reunite. He sort of busts out of slavery thanks to Sid. And then like Jill kind of gets nursed back to health, and even she has a really good character arc. And like it would be so typical of them to like write them immediately as boyfriend girlfriend or immediately make this love connection, but like Jill like tries to like have close intimate moments with Clive, and he's just not ready for it. Like he just still feels like he's failed his whole life. And like it eventually does happen, but it feels natural at that point, if not a little campy. But like she has a strong story of her own. She is not sexualized in any way. I was really, really happy for that. Even when she primes into Shiva, like Shiva just looks like a fucking badass ice goddess. And like Jill herself is a very talented fighter. She gets revenge on people that wronged her. She has an arc. She's very well done. I've seen some articles saying that she's just like another like one-dimensional female trope of a character. I disagree. But ask women how they feel, or ask, women who've played this game how they feel. Maybe I'm wrong. But that's just my perspective. Sid as well. Ralph Ineson, fantastic voice. Fantastic actor, even better voice. Voices Sid, does an excellent job with his story, and the writing for him is excellent. His daughter Mid, who shows up, is very well done. She gets a good story as well. A lot of the side characters do. It's definitely the most fleshed out story in terms of character arcs, I think, out of any Final Fantasy game, and really out of any RPG that I've played in recent years. Yeah, like, it's not just the main party that gets its due. I mean, even Torgal gets his due. Like, it's crazy that a dog has his own side quest at the end of the game to, like, show some, like, really sweet moments between him and Clive, and, like, how even during the time that Clive was missing and him and Torgal was separated, like, Torgal was still looking for him. Like, it was just so well done, and, like, that really got me choked up as a dog person, and, like, everything is just so well done with these characters that it's, like, shocking. It's shocking. Like, I beat the game today, which is the 4th of July. 2 days ago, I, like, gained access to the final dungeon of the game, like, the final area of the game, the final boss. But then, as I got that, all these side quests popped up. A bunch of hunts appeared on the board. So I spent all day yesterday, I'm talking 8 hours, going through all of that, thinking it would only take me 2 or 3 hours and I would beat the game. But it took at least 8 hours to go through all of that. And, like, it just kept going. Like, the game just kept going. And it really took me, like, I reached the end of the game and it took me 2 days to finish it. Like, it was crazy. Total time spent was 71 hours. That's with watching the credits. That's with, like, maybe 2 hours of note-taking while playing, all added up, but really long game. I don't know how anybody beats this game in 30 hours. I feel like you have to do 0 side quests, skip dialogue, and just rush through. Like, I'm sure if you skipped every cutscene, it'd probably be like 10 hours, but, like, I don't know how you do this in 30 hours. You just have to touch nothing, basically. Cool. So the story is really, really well done. I was very pleased with it. The villain of the game is... There's a few villains in this game. I'm happy to report, playing through this game, you feel a lot of Final Fantasy IX in this game. Which is interesting because after 7 and 8, 9 and 10 were basically developed at the same time. So 9 released in 2000, 10 released in 2001, and they were kind of developed side by side. 9 famously was like a return to traditional Final Fantasy. So it's like a medieval setting, like an easier story, or like a more grounded story, and turn-based gameplay, which hadn't changed up until that point and wouldn't until 12. But 9's story is so good until the final 10 minutes. And then it just takes an absolute nosedive and introduces a villain that was never alluded to in any part of the game, never spoken about. There's no talk of gods in this game at all, but suddenly this god shows up and you've got to fight him. And if you die to him, then you've got to start all over at the actual, what you thought was the final boss. It's just so frustrating that, I think it's Necron is his name. So frustrating that boss is in there. Made 0 sense. But because there's so much Final Fantasy 9 and 16, there's so many little hints and Easter eggs, I wouldn't be surprised if Square says it to take place on the same planet, just like eons apart, sort of like 7 and 10 do. I was worried that, like, the villain, like the puppet master, was going to show up in the last 10 minutes of this. Doesn't happen. The villain does change about halfway through. Like, the villain does reveal himself, actually maybe like a quarter of the way through. Like, the villain first shows up and then the mystery begins. And I think the villain is very well fleshed out. His story is explained. His motivations are explained. He is a whole character with flaws and strengths, and I like that. It's a really, really good villain. Looks gorgeous. Looks absolutely gorgeous. Every time this villain is on screen, I am blown away. Like, he just looks so dope. And especially in the final fight, just looks crazier and crazier. So, really cool villain, really good storylines. Every single character that I can think of has a good character arc, including the minor ones that are really just there to like feed you information. Like, for some reason, they get a whole thing. So it's really cool. Speaking of feeding information, there is a system in this game called the Active Time Lore, or is that what it's called? Active Time Lore FF16. Yeah, Active Time Lore. So Active Time Lore is this sort of like Amazon Prime thing of lore. So basically in any cutscene, really anywhere in the game, you can hold down the touchpad and then a screen pops up and it shows all the characters in the scene, the setting, the point of the story that you're at, and then you can click into one of those. And the whole time it just pauses the cutscene, click into one of those, read a paragraph or two about the character. This way you're never really lost. You know who everyone is, and if you ever forget, boop, just pull it up. You get everything you need. This is accessible not only in those cutscenes, but you can visit one of two people. You can either visit the Loresman in your hideaway or your hub, or you can visit this woman, Vivian. Vivian has maps and explains like the battlefield of Final Fantasy 16 and the wars that are waging in the story and the key players. There's this whole big wheel of people that shows like all their relationships, although again, between Terrence and Dion, it doesn't show their relationship, just alludes to it in one sentence. I can't stand it. But it's really good. This way you can't forget anybody, and it's really cool. As people change alliances or move, they start being represented in different parts of the graph. Really, really cool. The battlefield map, I admittedly didn't use it that much just because I found it kind of easy to follow. Didn't really need to consult it, but it's there if you need. And then the Loresman keeps all of those active time lore tidbits available. And tons of backstory for the world. None of it's necessary to read. A lot of actual like lore and world building about the ancient civilizations of the world. Really, really cool stuff. The game does an excellent job of telling its story and also allowing people to catch up. This is really useful in case you like take a break from the game. Like just say you go on a 2-week vacation or a week vacation, you come back and you're like, yo, where the hell am I in this game? Boom, active time lore. You've got it all there for you. And you can even rewind it to different points of the game to like see what the story was at this point. And it's all represented by Clive on the bar. Really, really great stuff. Okay, so speaking of the villain, one of the things that I wanted to like just talk about briefly about this villain is his motivations. And so I feel like, especially coming from 15, the villain of 15 was who knows who until the end of the game. Like suddenly it's Arden. Like it just didn't make a lot of sense. His motivations were explained, but they kind of weren't. It was just really poorly done. The motivations of this villain are really well done. And throughout the game, it sort of answers the question of like, if this dude's so powerful, why is he allowing this to happen? Like, why is he allowing Clive to get so powerful? Why is he allowing the party to get so powerful? Why doesn't he just end it? And there's a really good reason that I don't want to spoil for you, but what I will say is that it plays into the game and the gameplay, and it's really, really well done. Okay, so a couple other really good points, or positive points. So going into 16, because of my concerns from 15, I was mostly going into this game looking at it through the lens of how will this game, or how can this game be looked at when trying to think about 7 Rebirth? And like I fully admit, like I was not sold on 16. Political intrigue, medieval settings don't really do it for me. Never watched Game of Thrones. I never read Lord of the Rings. I've seen the movies. I'm not like the biggest fan. Just don't dig high fantasy. So I was really looking at this to like see a glimpse of 7 Rebirth. I'm glad that it turned out to be so good, but I still am looking at it through that lens in some ways, or, you know, trying to extrapolate things through that lens. And during Summer Games Fest last month, we got our first gameplay trailer of 7 Rebirth. And, you know, where 7 Remake lets out or ends, we would effectively, in the base game, be going into the open world and explore the world map, and like it sort of opens up. 7 is still fairly linear. It's a pretty linear game, but because you have access to the world map, you can backtrack and go wherever you want, kind of, within segments. And I think if 16 is anything to go by, 7 Rebirth is in a really good place. The way 16 treats its open world is kind of interesting. The game is quite linear. However, early on in the game, it kind of holds your hand, and you're really just going from place to place, like with cutscenes in between. Like you're literally brought from place to place. You do a lot of warping on the world map, and then you're going through these story scenarios, and then you can't visit that area again. And to me, that's frustrating. Like I was kind of frustrated starting out that like, okay, this isn't a world map. It's just a screen that I choose a quick travel point to, and I go there. That's certainly true for the opening 6 or 7 hours of the game. After that, it opens up quite nicely. There is not an overworld. However, an overworld in the traditional sense of like, Final Fantasies 1 through 9. But it's a bit closer to 10. There's no airship, at least not in normal difficulty mode. And I don't think that there is an airship in this game, even in Final Fantasy difficulty. Like story-wise, it just wouldn't make sense. But it's similar to 10 in that you have that airship menu where you can pick a point where the airship drops you off, and then you can walk from one end of the world to the other. Like you can do that if you want, with minimal travel. Like you do have to take a boat from Besaid Island to not Luca. Oh my god, the second island where you get Ifrit. I forget the name of that. And then after that you go to Luca, and then you're on the main continent. You can walk from Mihen Road to Zanarkand. Like you can walk the whole world in 10. 16 is pretty similar. However, it has elements of Final Fantasy 14. And now I know what you might be thinking, like, oh god, an MMO in a single-player game, that's not going to work. Don't worry. So basically the way it works is after you get through those very linear sections, I'm racking my brain as to what the name of that island is. As you get past those linear sections, you come to a field, and you can then walk around this field, and if you pull up the map, you will notice that there's like big open areas that are connected either by bridges or elevators, or there's like a town in the middle. But it feels natural. Like the boundaries are natural. It's either like rivers that you can't cross or like flooded ruins, but it doesn't feel so linear that it feels like you're on rails. There's enemies out in the world or like out in the field that you go up and like combat just automatically starts. Some enemies are hidden, like you have these like shrub enemies that just sort of like come out of the bushes and like kind of scare you. If you're in the desert, scorpions come out of the sand. There's like enemy birds around. Like there's a lot of like naturalness to this world, but it's not like completely open and explorable like an overworld map would be in a classic Final Fantasy. I think we are far removed from that. It's been 23 years since we've had that. Final Fantasy IX was released, I think, like this weekend 20 years ago. When was Final Fantasy IX released? Fantasy IX release date. July 7th, 2000. Yeah, this week, 23 years ago. So we're gone. That's not a thing anymore. But I think 16 treats it really well. You have these stretches of land that you can explore that are connected by natural bridges and natural streams, and you can explore this world. The kingdoms, however, are not connected. So you have your world map, but if you want to go from, think of it like a biome, like if you want to go from this kingdom to this kingdom, you have to warp. However, this other kingdom has its own open field that you have to explore and uncover things, and there's towns and villages and everything to explore. Typically, they're like separated by cities, but you don't ever get to go into those cities, like I mentioned before. So it feels a little disconnected, but it does make sense. But if you could go through those cities, it would basically be a fully connected world. That's kind of the way to think about it. The biomes are not that diverse. It feels like there were probably ideas for more environments because they are spoken about in the story. Like Jill is from what's called the Northern Territories. She is Shiva's dominant. Chances are That's a cold region, right? That makes sense. Hugo Kupka is Titans dominant. He's from the deserts or the canyons. Like, it makes sense, right? So it sounds like there was more ideas from more biomes, but just ultimately unexplored. And the way it's kind of explained in the story is like the blight just destroyed that land. So you never get to see it. Kind of unfortunate, but it makes sense. Point being, the way this game handles the quote-unquote open world is really nice. It is much better than 15. 15 had this like open field, but there was just nothing in it. This feels like a really good balance. And the return of towns and villages and people to talk to and vendors, it is so nice that this stuff is back. It's basically been missing since 10. 12 had them occasionally. Like, there were some cities that, I guess 12 did have towns, now that I think about it. But so scratch that. They weren't in 13. All the stores were at save points for some reason. 15 didn't have more than, I think it was 2 towns. It had Sid's gas station. It had the town up north. And then you took the boat to the place where your girlfriend was. And then that was kind of it. Like, there was really no towns in between. So it's nice that this like feels like a fully fleshed out world. And the field is handled very nicely. And I think it bodes very well for 7 Rebirth. Speaking of the field, we have chocobos as well, or as they call them in this game, chocobos. It feels like with 7 Rebirth, if you look at that gameplay trailer, it feels like chocobos are going to be more fleshed out in 7 Rebirth, which makes a lot of sense because the original 7 had a huge system around now I'm saying it both ways. Had a huge system around chocobos. I think all 16 did was establish that there's no right way to say chocobo. 7 had a huge system around chocobos. So in that 7 Rebirth trailer, they showed the UI for chocobos. It said scour and scent, which says to me that maybe they're going to be used to like dig up treasures. In 16, it's just a traversal mechanism. You can call the chocobo pretty much anywhere in the field as long as you're not in a town, and then you can run, and that's it. So yeah, I'm happy the chocobos are there. 15, again, felt very much like chocobos were there for the sake of them being there. Like, you could only rent them. You could really only use them in certain places. And it just felt like a side thing. They were pretty hidden, if I recall correctly. Like, that ranch was kind of up in the middle of nowhere near that dungeon that only opens at night. Like, I didn't like the way that 15 handled chocobos at all. Okay, so as far as the gameplay goes, the combat of 16 is extremely unique. This is an action RPG through and through. It just has the level of storytelling of a Final Fantasy that you can come to expect from a Final Fantasy, although it's improved since years past. So, famously, the combat director from Devil May Cry 5 was hired away from Capcom and hired by Square Enix to develop the combat system of this game, of Final Fantasy 16. And boy, is it fun. I mentioned before that the focus is very much on the icon abilities, and it should be. Like, that plays into the story. Throughout the story, Clive is gaining the powers of various icons, and you have everything from Phoenix, which is like flames but healing. You have Ifrit, which is just straight up fire. You have Garuda, which is wind. You have Titan, which is earth, Bahamut, which is light, Odin, which is darkness, and then Shiva, which is ice. And so you have like this whole gamut of abilities. Maybe Leviathan's DLC with water, who knows? But like, these abilities are awesome. A lot of times they can be sort of boiled down to 2 categories. Either it's going to deal a lot of damage or it's going to have a lot of utility. And the utility ones typically are sort of like dodging or parrying abilities. And so the combat, the game really tries to keep you very engaged in the combat. And if you rely on these parry abilities or these dodge abilities, such as Garuda's Rook's Gambit or Titan has one, can't remember the name of it. Bahamut has one as well, where like you sort of like sprout wings. You can't do anything except for dodge. You can't attack. But the more times you get precision dodge, your mega flare meter fills up. And if that gets to, it's a max of level 4 if you actually level it up spending points. If you level it up to 4, you then get like a 15-second duration mega flare that just peppers every enemy on the field within a radius. And like, it always puts most of the focus on whatever you're attacking. Does a ton of damage. It breaks their will or their pressure meter really fast. And so like, the combat is very much centered around these abilities. And it keeps it very fast and very fresh. You get new icons up until the end of the game. Like your last icon, you basically get right before the final boss. Now, the drawback to this is that there are stretches of time where you're not gaining a new icon, especially if you're doing all the side quests and all the hunts as they appear in the game, which I do recommend you do because you can lock yourself out of certain things. And like certain hunts are only accessible through side quests. They don't actually appear on the board until you start the side quest. So I really recommend do everything available to you before doing the next main story mission, because you never know, something could change and you could get locked out. But you get icons up until the end of the game, and it's very difficult to want to change your play style when you've grown so comfortable with it. Starting out, you start off with Phoenix. Ifrit is really just reserved for the other stuff, for the icon battles. And then you get Garuda, and then you get, which is Wind, and then that's kind of all you have for a little while. You get those two, and then after that you get Titan, and then after that you get Ramu for Lightning. Sorry about that. So there's 7 total. There's Ifrit, Phoenix, Garuda, Ramu, Titan, Bahamut, Shiva, Odin. So, like, for the beginning of the game, you just have access to Phoenix, and then you get Garuda. So then you can flip between the 2. And then you get Ramu. So now you can flip between the 3. But by the time you unlock Titan, you still can only have 3 active at a time within combat. You can change them anytime out of the menu outside of combat. You can switch them out. And anytime you master an ability, that ability then becomes available regardless of what icon you have equipped. You can always slot that ability into a slot of any icon. So like, for example, Phoenix has Flames of Rebirth. If you spend however much AP it is to master that ability, you can then put Flames of Rebirth in with Garuda or with anybody. Doesn't matter. If that ability is mastered, you can attach it to any icon, doesn't matter. Now that said, you'll have those 3, Phoenix, Garuda, Ramu, and then it's a while before you unlock Titan. And because of this, you get very used to playing a certain way, and those 3 are quite strong. And so you're not exactly incentivized to change up your playstyle and explore these new icons. They're all viable. I think my final setup was Titan, Garuda, Bahamut. But throughout the world, I think it's after like the World of Ruin comes into play, or whatever you want to call that, there are obelisks that you will find, or tablets that you will find throughout the world. You'll find them pretty early on. There's 7 total, 1 for each icon, and these are like combat trials specifically for those iconic abilities. So if you start it, each one corresponds to an icon. So the first one, you only have Phoenix's abilities plus your regular combat abilities. And they are timed challenges with several waves of enemies within each level. So there's like, level 1 is 3 waves, but in level 1, you only get 2 abilities. You go through those 3 waves, your timer stops, and then however much bonus time you accrued gets added on. You go into the next stage, and now your abilities might change. It's still the same icon, but your abilities might change, so now you got to fight differently. Because you are unlocking icons up until the end of the game, it is very worth going for those iconic challenges. They're called chronoliths. Extremely worth doing, and I'm really glad I did, because there was no shot that I was going to equip Odin right before the final boss. That's basically when you get him. Like, you get Odin, you can go to the end of the game. Like, it's that quick. There's no shot that I was going to change my playstyle for the final boss, right? But I still went back and did all those chronoliths before finishing the game, and that final chronolith has me play with Odin's abilities, and I'm really glad I did, because they are so powerful and so good. And it's nice to see that even though the game backloads like the final 2 icons kind of back to back really quick, they're not any less fleshed out or less useful or less powerful than anything else. Everything is viable. All different playstyles are viable, and for like an action RPG, that's pretty remarkable. And I'm just really glad for it. And like, it makes sense to bring the dude in from Devil May Cry. If you want to make an action game, like, go for it. So the combat is fantastic. I had fun from start to finish, and it's so much fun that I'm actually like heavily considering going back and playing on Final Fantasy difficulty, which you unlock after beating the game. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is this is more of a conversation topic, less so like a pro or con. So like, consider this part of the review over, but I didn't want to make like a separate video for this topic, but it has to do with Final Fantasy in general. So with the release of 16, one of the very first complaints, even among friends of mine publicly on Twitter, is that it feels like you're just watching the game and not really playing the game. And that's because the game is so story heavy. There's a lot of talking, there's a ton of dialogue, and it can frustrate people. And I get it. I get why that might frustrate you. However, the game very rarely takes control away from you in the way that, like, I don't know, a God of War might like force you to walk really slow while the characters like have exposition and like rotate the camera in different ways. Final Fantasy does that a lot less. It's just you walk somewhere, it's time to talk, put the controller down, or hold it if you want to feel the rumble of a sword strike in a cinematic or something. I get why that might frustrate people. However, this is not new to Final Fantasy. Since Final Fantasy I, the game has been heavily narrative focused, heavily character driven. For 20 years, between, I guess like 15 years, between Final Fantasies 1 through 9, including everything on Game Boy up to that point, even the Wonder Swan games, like, you were reading the whole time. There was no voice acting, no nothing, but there was thousands, tens of thousands of lines of dialogue, and you just read it instead of listened. And so I dislike that criticism of Final Fantasy, and like, what I think it's a valid criticism, but what I dislike is that people are like, oh, Final Fantasy's changed now, like, I've got to sit here and listen to this all the time, like, this isn't what I want from Final Fantasy, this isn't how it used to be. Yes, it was. It was. Except now, instead of having blue text boxes that we read and just press X to skip to the next one, we listen to voice actors do an incredible job. That's it. Like, that's the difference. The content hasn't changed. The content delivery mechanism has. And I get it. Some people may not like it, but Final Fantasy has not changed. It is still an extremely, extremely story-driven, character-driven game with story as the focus, that where combat definitely is a strength, but is often put second. It's not a distant second, except maybe between like 13 and 15, it wasn't that great. And 12, I didn't like. I know some people love it, but like, the point being, the story has always been the focus of this game. The characters have always been the focus of this game. Gameplay came to a close second. And maybe it's as simple, maybe the frustration comes from simply no longer needing to hold the controller during scenes of extended dialogue and no longer needing to press X or circle to advance the dialogue. Maybe it's as simple as that, like the controller is not in your hand. Again, I get that. I think that's valid. But to say that like these games have just, become just cutscene fests is wrong. It's just intellectually dishonest to say that. So yeah, the story of 16 is great. It's told really well, and I don't think it matters if it's told via text or dialogue or voice dialogue. It doesn't matter. But that's it. Those are my thoughts, coming in just over an hour. Highly recommend Final Fantasy 16. It could have been better when it came to representation. It's 2023. I'm not saying every single game out there needs to have, it has to address social issues. Not saying that at all, but it can't be left unsaid that the lack of representation in this game, and even the representation that it does have is a half measure in some cases, is a mark against it. Other than that, those are the only core issues that I have with the game. Discuss my issues with the design and the gameplay. It's fine. It doesn't make the game worse. It just could have been better. And I think the strengths of this game far outweigh the positives. But again, I understand if the negatives outweighed for you. That's the point of a review and of the human experience. So highly recommend it. Very glad I played it. Excited to go back on Final Fantasy difficulty. and keep playing. Okay, so I want to give a shout out to my channel members as thank you. So thank you very much to John Aldrich with 38 months, Hector J. Estrada with 25 months, Joe Saunders with 25 months, Daniel Cockerill with 20 months, The Old One with 15 months, Brian Brubaker with 15 months, Bagged at Money with 11 months, Greg with 9 months, X Lightning 84 with 4 months, Harv Fontania with 2 months, Logan Conrad Younger Remembered with 28 days, and Caroline Hewitt with 22 days. Thank you very much to my channel members. Your support means a lot. Okay, if this has interested you, or any of these topics have interested you, leave a comment. Let me know why. Let me know your thoughts on the game. This is primarily a guides and walkthrough channel, so I am going to be continuing to upload guides for Final Fantasy 16. Still have a lot to go. I did not take time off work for this game. That's why they've been slowly uploading, but get to them all eventually. And yeah, be sure to subscribe for when those go live. But that's it for me. All right. As always, I'm SweetJohnnyCage. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.